I never planned for anything significant to happen that evening. I simply wanted my shoulder to stop throbbing. It had been hurting for days, a deep nagging ache that kept tightening every time I lifted something or reached too far. My husband didn't notice. He rarely noticed anything anymore. His world had narrowed into deadlines, his phone, and whatever silence he needed to keep himself detached from me. I sometimes wondered if he even remembered the sound of my voice without checking a calendar to see when we last spoke properly. The house had been quiet for hours. My step-nephew Adam was staying with us for a few weeks while attending a short professional course nearby. He was in his mid-20s, responsible and reserved, trying his best not to be a burden in a home that already felt emotionally starved. He kept to himself, studied most of the time, and spoke politely when necessary. There was nothing complicated about him, nothing inappropriate, nothing to question. Just a young man trying to get through the month without disturbing anyone. I had strained my shoulder earlier that morning while organizing old storage boxes. The pain grew sharper as the day went on. When I tried to lift my arm to reach a glass from the upper cabinet, a sharp twitch made me gasp. I didn't think anyone heard, but Adam appeared near the doorway a moment later, concern etched clearly on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. I forced a smile. One of those fake ones you use to pretend everything is fine when it obviously isn't. "It's just my shoulder. It's been tense all week." He hesitated before speaking again, shifting slightly like he was unsure if he should even offer help. "I learned some basic muscle release techniques in my training last month. I could try to help, if you're comfortable with that." I stared at him for a moment, surprised he even offered. It wasn't the kind of suggestion you expected from someone who barely said more than good morning. But his tone wasn't forward and his expression wasn't bold. It was careful, respectful, almost anxious. I could tell he was prepared for a rejection, maybe even expecting it. My arm pulsed again, and the pain made the decision easier than it should have been. "If you're sure," I said quietly. He nodded, relieved but still tentative. There was something almost fragile in the way he responded, as though he wasn't sure he deserved my trust. When I settled into a comfortable position, I noticed his hands hovering for a second, unsure of where to begin. They were steady at first, but the moment he made contact, I felt a subtle tremor. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, just a gentle shake, the kind that reveals someone is trying very hard to stay composed. "You're shaking," I said softly, not wanting to embarrass him. "Sorry," he murmured. "I just don't want to hurt you or do anything wrong." His honesty disarmed me instantly. It wasn't nervousness of something forbidden. It was fear of misjudging pressure, fear of crossing a line, fear of disrespect. His hands were warm and cautious, the complete opposite of careless. As he worked slowly, the tension in my shoulder eased little by little, almost reluctantly. I felt the pain dissipate, but it was his quiet sincerity that made my chest feel unexpectedly heavy. My husband hadn't touched me in weeks, not even a hand on my back in passing. Yet here was someone who wasn't obligated to care at all, focusing more on my comfort than the person who vowed to stand beside me for life. For a brief, suspended moment, I wondered when simple kindness had become something rare enough to startle me. And that was the moment I should have understood where this could lead, but I didn't stop it. His hand steadied gradually, and with that calmness came an unexpected shift in the air around us. I could feel him breathing a little slower now, not from confidence, but from a quiet determination to do this correctly. His touch wasn't bold or suggestive. It was measured, attentive, and almost overly careful, like he was afraid that even the slightest mistake would break something fragile. I realized then that the shaking wasn't fear of me. It was fear of crossing a boundary he deeply respected. I tried to relax, but the softness in his movements made something inside me tighten in a different way. It wasn't physical. It was the unfamiliar sensation of being tended to, of someone paying attention without being asked, without being pressured, without expecting anything in return. I had forgotten what that felt like. Forgotten how much I missed being treated gently. "You don't have to be so tense," he said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. "I'm just trying to help." "I know," I replied, and I meant it. "It's just been a heavy week." There was a pause, not awkward but meaningful. The kind of silence where someone wants to say something but weighs every syllable before speaking. "I hear you sometimes," he confessed, his tone cautious. "Late at night, when you think everyone is asleep." I stiffened, heat rushing through my face. I didn't need to ask what he meant. There had been nights when the house felt unbearably silent, when my thoughts were too loud, and I couldn't hold everything inside without breaking somewhere. I'd cry quietly, hoping no one would hear, especially not someone who wasn't even part of our household permanently. "I'm sorry," I whispered, embarrassed. "You don't have to apologize," he said immediately. "I just knew something was hurting you more than a strained shoulder." The sincerity in his voice was sharper than any pain I'd felt that week. I had grown used to brushing off my emotions with a practiced smile and a casual lie. But Adam saw through the cracks I never meant to reveal. It unsettled me in a way that felt dangerously comforting. His fingers pressed lightly on a tight spot, and for a moment I closed my eyes, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. He didn't comment, didn't take advantage of the vulnerability. He simply adjusted the pressure, quietly attentive, quietly there. "It's not my place to ask what's wrong," he continued. "But you don't deserve to carry everything alone." His words landed deeper than his hands ever could. They weren't flirtatious or intrusive. They were genuine, spoken by someone who witnessed my pain without judgment or entitlement. And it hit me just how starved I had been for anyone to even notice that I was drowning in silence. "You're kind," I murmured, feeling my throat tighten. He shook his head softly. "Not really. I just care when I see someone hurting." That simple statement shifted something between us. Not romantic, not inappropriate, but undeniably intimate in its own quiet way. Emotional closeness doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives in the form of someone seeing a truth you've buried, and still choosing to stay steady beside you. The weight in my chest grew heavier, not because of anything he did, but because of everything my husband had stopped doing long ago. Adam's care felt like a reminder of something I once believed marriage naturally provided: attention, empathy, a gentle presence. Now it was coming from someone who had no obligation to give it. He continued working on the tense muscles. Not a single moment felt wrong, yet every second felt too charged. I wasn't reacting to his hands. I was reacting to being seen. For the first time in a long while, I felt a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with touch and everything to do with being noticed. And I knew deep down that this was how emotional lines begin to blur, quietly, softly, without either person fully realizing until it's too late. The longer he worked, the more I sensed the quiet tension inside him. Not inappropriate, not uncontrolled, but something deeply human and conflicted. His breath had a faint tremor, not loud enough to notice unless you were already tuned to every subtle shift the way I suddenly was. I asked if he was all right, not because I doubted his ability but because the room felt weighted with something unspoken. That he paused, hands hovering just above my skin. "I don't ever want to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. "If anything feels wrong, tell me and I'll stop immediately." The sincerity struck me harder than the pressure ever could. I wasn't used to someone prioritizing my boundaries, not even in casual ways. My husband had grown indifferent long ago, absent in the moments that needed presence, dismissive in moments that required understanding. But now, here was someone younger, someone who didn't owe me anything, demonstrating a respect so gentle it felt unfamiliar. "You're not crossing any line," I replied, though part of me feared that emotionally I was. He resumed with more care than before, his movements steady, thoughtful. He wasn't touching me like a man seeking closeness. He was touching me like someone who understood the fragility of another person's heart. A faint exhale escaped him, as if he had been holding his breath. "I just don't want you to think I'm doing this for the wrong reason," he said. "You're married. I know that. And you're someone I respect." The honesty made my chest tighten. Respect shouldn't feel like a luxury, yet it did. "I know your intentions," I said, but my voice wavered. "You've been careful. Careful because it matters," he whispered, almost to himself. Those words lingered in the air, heavier than any gesture. It wasn't affection he was expressing. It was admiration wrapped in restraint. And I found myself absorbing it too easily, too hungrily. Not because I wanted something from him, but because it had been so long since I'd felt valued in even the smallest ways. He pressed gently on a final knot, and I inhaled sharply, not from pain, but from the unexpected wave of relief that washed through me. He withdrew his hands immediately, stepping back as if proximity itself could blur lines neither of us wanted to cross. "That should help," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. He was distancing himself physically, trying to anchor his boundaries even as something inside him trembled at their edges. But there was something else beneath the restraint, concern, maybe even protectiveness. He looked at me like he was reading emotions I didn't know were showing. "Your shoulder isn't the only thing hurting," he said quietly. "Anyone can see that if they actually pay attention." I didn't respond. I couldn't. His gaze wasn't bold, just painfully perceptive, and I felt exposed in ways I had never intended. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exposure that comes when someone sees the emptiness in your life and doesn't pretend it isn't there. "I should give you space," he murmured, taking another small step back. "Before either of us says something we'll regret." He wasn't running away. He was protecting the thin line neither of us wanted to break. But the moment he created distance, a hollow ache replaced the warmth he'd given so effortlessly he cared. That was the truth echoing between us. And caring was dangerous because I had forgotten how to handle it. As he walked toward the door, he hesitated one last time. "I'm here if you need help," he said, voice low, controlled. "Just not the kind that complicates things." His restraint should have calmed me. Instead, it made my heart pound with the terrifying awareness that something between us had shifted, and neither of us knew how to shift it back. After he left the room, the quiet settled around me like a weight I hadn't prepared for. The kind of silence that forces you to confront the things you managed to avoid while someone else was in the room. My shoulder felt lighter, but my chest felt impossibly heavier. I kept replaying his last words, everything about them gentle, restrained, respectful. He wasn't pulling away from me. He was pulling himself back from a boundary he didn't trust his emotions to navigate. And that said more than anything else could. When my husband finally came home hours later, he didn't notice the ice pack on my shoulder or the exhaustion on my face. He walked past me with a distracted greeting, too absorbed in whatever had filled his day to even glance long enough to sense anything was different. I watched him move around the room, untouched by awareness, untouched by concern. I waited for him to ask if I was all right, or even why I was sitting so still, but nothing. Not even a second look. The emptiness settled deeper in the days that followed. I tried to act normal, but every interaction with Adam felt wrapped in unspoken awareness. He avoided lingering in any room I entered, not out of discomfort but out of sheer caution. He kept conversations brief, polite, neutral. The respectful distance he enforced only highlighted how deeply that moment had affected him. And the more he stepped back, the more I felt the gravity of what had almost happened, without ever actually happening. Late one evening, I passed by the living room and found him packing his course materials, preparing to return to his own place now that his program was nearly finished. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if approaching him would pressure a conversation he might not want to have. But he looked up and gave me a small, sincere smile, one that held no confusion, no guilt, only genuine warmth and a hint of sadness. "I'm leaving tomorrow morning," he said, as if he owed me that information. "Didn't want to go without saying thank you for letting me stay." "You didn't have to rush off," I replied quietly. "You were never a burden. I just think space is better," he said, choosing his words carefully. "For everyone." I understood instantly. His presence had exposed cracks I'd tried to ignore for too long. Not because he intended to, not because anything inappropriate occurred, but because a moment of care from him had illuminated the absolute neglect in my marriage. He wasn't the problem, he was the mirror. Before he zipped up his bag, he paused and looked at me with that same perceptive gentleness. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "But no one should have to be strong alone all the time." The sincerity in his voice left me breathless. There was nothing romantic in his expression, nothing suggestive. Just a recognition of my pain that I had never voiced, and an understanding he never exploited. Emotional closeness doesn't need to be acted on to leave a mark, it simply needs to be acknowledged. The next morning, I heard him leave quietly. No dramatic goodbye, no lingering glance, no unfinished sentences. Just a soft closing of the door and the faint echo of someone who entered my life with caution and left it with the same respect. My husband didn't notice he was gone until nearly a week later, but I noticed his absence instantly. Not because I missed something inappropriate, nothing of that sort ever happened. I missed the presence of someone who saw me when I felt invisible. Someone who cared without taking advantage. Someone who reminded me of a truth I had been denying for years. Emotional neglect can be far more painful than anything physical. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't unfeel the quiet shift he had created inside me. A shift that made it impossible to pretend my marriage was simply going through a phase. A shift that made me realize the most dangerous kind of infidelity begins long before a line is physically crossed. Often in the moment someone else finally understands the pain you've been hiding.